So when you walk into the radiology session in first year MD, what is the first paradoxical thing you see on the abdominal CT? The gallbladder is described like this. What is paradox about it? Our biology science teacher taught it that gallbladder will be hanging down and this gallbladder will be pointing up. So that is the first thing you will learn, that how come it is facing in the upward direction, right? So it has got a very thin rim. This is a normal gallbladder, whereas this is a thick rim. Thickening of the gallbladder is what you are able to see here. Adenomyomatosis of the gallbladder is a very important entity where there is a epithelial proliferation, muscular hypertrophy, intramural diverticulae, and those intramural diverticulae which are found in that thickened wall are called as the Rokitansky-Ashkoff sinuses. And on ultrasound you find a comet tail reverberation artifacts. And what is the other condition other than adenomyomatosis where you can come across even in emphysematous cholecystitis? Now here you can see, doctor, actually in the wall there is a small comet like tail in the gallbladder inside the mura along the wall along the thickened wall on the ultrasound, which is called the comet tail sign in the case of the adenomyomatosis. Virchow triad includes thrombosis, stasis in the veins and hypercoagulability. Now spontaneous CSF leakage, it is an entity in itself. There are so many causes, it can be otorrhea, it can be rhinorrhea, so many ways. So now the question is, what is the most common cause basically for CSF leakage? Blunt trauma generally. There is an entity called spontaneous intracranial hypotension syndrome called SIHS, which can lead to the development of a persistent CSF leak in those individuals who have got a defect in their ethmoid bone. Those individuals develop it. And similarly, those who have undergone a lumbar puncture, persistent orthostatic headache if they develop after lumbar puncture, they also need to be entertained with a diagnosis called spontaneous intracranial hypotension syndrome. Then pseudotumor cerebri is another entity which also can lead to the development of a spontaneous CSF leak. So that is the reason, doctor, out of all these options which are being given, I only find raised ICT should not be responsible, rather it is a fall of the ICT in the form of intracranial hypotension syndrome which should be responsible. Now CSF pressure decided not by the production, rather by the absorption of it through the arachnoid granulations, which is responsible for a non-communicating, communicating hydrocephalus. Now in the total parenteral nutrition, do you see hyper or hypophosphatemia? Many times we discuss this. There is something called refeeding syndrome. The moment you are started total TPN in a malnourished individual, there is a refeeding syndrome. Suddenly all the phosphate in the body will move into the intracellular compartment, and that will create hypophosphatemia as a complication of refeeding syndrome of TPN, not the hyperphosphatemia is what you need to precisely remember. Where will classical and complement pathway will merge together? It is at the level of the C3 complement is the point where they basically will be merging together. Then what is CHIOP scale? Have you heard of it? It's an old question? I don't know. Oh, okay, good. It is the Children's Hospital Eastal Onatorio Pain Scale. So you have cry, facial, child verbal, torso, touch, legs. There are the different things which are the components to know whether how much pain is there for the child in addition to yourself. So it does not include oxygen saturation, it has got all the other three as the components of it. Now multiple myeloma diagnosis, you have some major criteria, minor criteria. Examiner is seriously interested about it. Major criteria is you have done bone marrow biopsy, plasma cells are greater than 30% of the entire cell population of the bone marrow, that is one definition. Similarly, elevated monoclonal immunoglobulin of the IgM type is another major. Whereas minor criteria include those punched out lesions in the skull and antibodies other than IgM like the IgG and IgA, and a bone marrow showing 10 to 30% of plasma cells instead of greater than 30% of plasma cells is the minor criteria. So lytic lesions falls in that, plasma cells 20% is between 10 to 30, IgM with even option D falls in the minor. So there is no comment about option C, which becomes the answer here. Patient on sulfonamides develops abdominal pain and seizures is an example of acute intermittent porphyria precipitating factors. One question inevitably comes on porphyria. Now circadian rhythm is basically by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is an impression above the level of the optic chiasma. Then DAG, cyclic AMP, inositol triphosphate, they are all the secondary messengers. We had been studying them from our first year MBBS. Now out of all this, the rubella has 14 to 23 days of incubation, hepatitis B has 4 to 20 weeks, hepatitis A has got about 4 weeks, but influenza has only 24 to 48 hours. So that is the reason shortest incubation period. Bacteriophage is a bacteria infected with a virus, not a virus infected with a bacteria, and it imparts toxigenicity, making a non-toxigenic corynebacterium becoming a toxigenic corynebacterium. So that's the reason option A becomes the correct answer. It is more important in the conjugation, transduction rather than transformation. Now for morbid obesity, what are the various surgical measures which are available? So we need to know that we do sleeve gastrectomy, which is a modified biliopancreatic diversion that we do with a duodenal switch, is one of the ways by which morbid obesity is treated. So option A is a true statement. Then we also use a horizontal gastroplasty, Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, biliopancreatic bypass also we use, and all these things are very much used. So that's the reason option C, biliopancreatic diversion, gastrectomy, sleeve gastrectomy, they are all there. Let us quickly talk about ileal transposition. So where do we transpose the terminal ileum into? We basically transpose the terminal ileum into the duodenum. Why do we do that? By doing that, what do we achieve? If you transpose the terminal ileum into the duodenum, it will cause stimulation of a substance called glucagon-like peptide called GLP-1. And this GLP-1 is the one which will cause slowing of the emptying of the stomach. So if somebody eats, let him eat, but stomach will not drain it out, because eating will cause glucose, GLP-1 production, and GLP-1 inhibit the stomach motility and prevents the food from coming down and getting absorbed. So that is the idea of transposing the terminal ileum into the duodenum and causing GLP-1 stimulation every time the food enters into the stomach. But there is a story about it, that later studies have proven that this ileal transposition as a method to treat obesity carries still need to be evaluated. They are successful in the animal studies. So I think must be the ileal transposition should be the answer, but they are not very sure, because how can gastrectomy, sleeve gastrectomy, are there in options? Oh my god. So maybe then examiner has this in the idea that ileal transposition is in animal level or human level or divine level. Do you know it or not, etc., etc. Sometimes difficult to derive what examiner wants. Now, which is not a permanent fold? Good question. Where is plica semilunaris, doctor? There are two plicae semilunaris in our body. One is in eye, other is in the tonsillar fosses, but both of them are permanent. Then you have got let us talk about it. In the upper part of the phageal arches, we have a plica semilunaris which is permanent. Then we have a spiral valve which is there in the ileum, and presence of spiral valve increases the surface of absorption. So that is the reason it is also a permanent one. Then you have the Houston's valves, which are the transverse folds of the rectum, and what is the purpose of them? They will hold the feces from drooping down, and also they will help to bring that strong urge of defecation. So that is the reason they are also very permanent. Then how about the mucosal folds of stomach? The moment stomach is distended, they are vanished. The moment it is not distended, they are present. So they are not the permanent fold is what you must be very sure about. Now vitamin K is very much required for the carboxylation of the glutamate, as all of you know very well. Nitrosolium, that is the nitro blue tetrazolium test, is used to know the efficacy of the NADH oxidase in the granulomatous disease, chronic granulomatous disease. And where is this NADH oxidase you are checking? Inside the macrophages, the phagocytes. So there is a reason it is to know the efficiency of phagocytosis in CGD patients. We do the assessment of NADH oxidase by doing the nitrosolium test is what need to be very much sure about. Let us talk about the Gleason staging in prostatic cancer, another traditional question in the exam. Now what are the parts of the Gleason stage? You have small uniform glands, more space between glands, infiltration of them into the margins, and irregular masses of cells with few glands and total lack of glandular structure at all is the stage 5, which is a poorly differentiated one. So now the examiner's question is, the score ranges from what value to what value, and how do you interpret that score fundamentally? Basically it is from 1 to 5, and higher the value, that means if the staging is 5, that carries a bad prognosis. So 1 to 10 is a wrong statement about it, 1 to 5 is the correct about Gleason staging, and a high score definitely carries a poor prognosis is what you have to be very sure about. Now for the GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, what is the gold standard? This gold standard, platinum standard, silver standard, they are all entrance oriented terminology. Do we really use the 24-hour pH monitoring for routinely for GERD patients? Somebody says I have belching sir in the OP, busy OP, you will say Pantocid 40 milligrams 6 weeks, come back after 6 weeks if I and you are alive. So then second is, our fellow gastroenterologist nowadays is not having good business of endoscopes. So slight pain is there anywhere, you don't see hand also. Please go and get an endoscope and bring the report. So there is a reason in the advent of endoscopy which can clearly anatomically delineate the reflux, identify Barrett's, endoscopy is good. But if endoscopy is not showing anything, still patient is saying that I have reflux, then you will go for this 24-hour pH monitoring and manometry, which are considered to be the gold standard, is what need to be basically remembered. Weber-Fechner's law means what? It is the intensity of stimulus will decide the magnitude of the sensation felt naturally. Somebody shouts, we hear it in a bigger voice, right? So higher, brighter light is focused, we see it brighter way. But there is a small exception about it. The sound has two properties. One is intensity of sound, other is called loudness of sound. Intensity of sound has a Weber-Fechner's obedience. It obeys to the law of Weber-Fechner. But loudness does not show the Weber-Fechner's law. That is, what is the law? Higher the intensity, higher is the sensory perception. That doesn't apply for the loudness of the sound is what need to be remembered. 18-year-old male with a Grover sign positive means proximal muscle weakness is there. Gottron's papules are there. What else is required? It is a case of dermatomyositis, and CPK levels immediately you should order to diagnose the because it is very sensitive in nature. And there are some serological parameters for the dermato and polymyositis, favorite topic of the examiner in rheumatology. Now let us talk about the ACE inhibitor. Where will ACE come into picture? Fundamentally, if you look at renin-angiotensin system, doctor, angiotensin 1 is converted to angiotensin 2 by the ACE in the pulmonary circulation. So it is not angiotensinogen 2 angiotensin 1, rather from 1 to 2 where the ACE is involved. Common way examiner tries to check you. Now the question is, enalapril lat is a prodrug. That's the reason it obviously has got a longer duration of action. Probably that becomes a reasonable answer here. Now Type 2 schizophrenia versus type 1 schizophrenia. What is the difference between the two? Basically, schizophrenia is divided into a reactive or a acute schizophrenia called type 1 and a process schizophrenia called type 2. Generally, in reactive schizophrenia, pre-morbid state of the patient is very good. He is a topper in entrance, got in MBBS, first year he got gold medal, but suddenly second year pharmacology exam is coming up and he is becoming violent and got psychotic. Pre-morbid condition is very good. But generally, if the pre-morbid state before the onset of the psychotic episode of schizophrenia diagnosis is good, it carries a good prognosis, is always the rule. Whereas the process schizophrenia, there is a poor pre-morbid state, they will have more negative symptomatology, and it has no relationship with any major life event. Without any of such predisposing flare-up, predisposing trigger, there is a flare-up of schizophrenia, called type 2. Type 2 generally carries a bad prognosis. So there is a reason: negative symptoms, poor response to the medical treatment, and if you do the imaging of the brain, in those who have type 2 schizophrenia, generally they will have a structural problem. But in type 1 people who have a good pre-morbid history, no, you don't find any abnormality in the brain. There is no organic basis for it. Now let's go to the next question. Sling and swab bandage. Does it come in orthopedic, sports medicine, altitude, aerospace medicine? It comes basically in mountaineering and all that. So that is the sling and swab bandage. It is to prevent the shoulder dislocation in those going for the sports and mountaineering activity. We basically use this bandage. Those who have Cartagenous syndrome, they can suffer the infertility because of the fallopian tube dysmotility is what need to be remembered. For the metastasis to occur, first and foremost thing is angiogenesis is a very important thing, ability to induce the angiogenesis. Then what is this microvic, microcatheter sustained release? So it is a high level of ENT, MCH ENT level. So there where you have some delivery systems for transtympanically deliver the gentamicin. So one of such method is a microvic microcatheter sustained release for the delivery of the gentamicin around the round window, that we use these microcatheters. Acrodermatitis enteropathica is due to zinc deficiency and it has an autosomal recessive inheritance. Have you guessed that? Option D is difficult to guess in exam because we think that zinc deficiency, keratomalacia, does it have any inheritance? No. Our line of thinking in exam will be like similarly, is rickets has any genetic predisposition? No. Why should then zinc deficiency should have? But it has autosomal recessive inheritance pattern. But what is the triad that you have? You basically have dermatitis, alopecia and diarrhea. Dementia is not a part of the triad of the enteropathica, is what need to be remembered. Selenium causes Keshan's cardiomyopathy. The vulnerable age for the vitamin A deficiency is between 6 months to 3 years, but clinical manifestation generally a little later. So with that we conclude at least the recall questions. I think still some 20 questions need to be recalled. If you have those recollection, please leave those questions with us, and we'll take another round on Monday to quickly review those leftover questions. Okay. So once more, thanks for a patient listening.